I think certainly it's obvious that less people are cutting peat just now. At one time on the moor, you'd see perhaps 6, 7 people or more cutting, but now it's very rarely you meet people on the moor cutting of a day. I suppose people's lives have changed. They may have less time for cutting peat or these types of job. Certainly, it saves money for you, but it's costly in terms of time. It does take time. The whole process takes time, and maybe people aren't quite so happy to spend a large part of the time with this kind of manual work. After a long day's work, perhaps at their office or wherever. But that said, it's a good kind of change to your routine. Just to be outside working, doing manual work is really quite healthy after a day, perhaps being inside. So it used to be very communal at one time. People would help each other. People would cut for each other at one time and share stories and share food as well, of course, and have a dram and so forth. I guess that's changed a bit. Certainly in my time, people would be paid for their day's work, so it wasn't a case that I do yours and you do mine, but people would be paid for the work. There was a going rate for a day's cutting, but people also would be fed as well. People would get their food and a dram, so maybe it was a kind of throwback to a time when people would just work for the food and the dram. So there's perhaps elements of the past in it, even now. But certainly, usually people are paid for their work. Certainly for children, it was a case that men. It was usually men who would cut. So I suppose it was perceived mainly as a man's job. But the children would often help with the lifting, making small stacks. And as you got a bit older, then you'd be able to have a try at the cutting. But it was a kind of perhaps when you're in your teens, then you'd get your first chance to cut it. So I suppose you felt it was a kind of honour to be able to actually cut the stuff as well, and to use the treischer, the peat knife, which is a very old one. It was made, I think, back in the 50s. So it's quite an old. It's a kind of family heirloom almost. It's that old, and it's often borrowed because it was a good treischer. It was not too heavy, but well balanced. But certainly it was social, and we often had people who would cut for us every year. We'd second people who would cut for us, and it was always good to have a day out with them and to share stories. Certainly you'd hear jokes and stories, perhaps a bit far-fetched sometimes, but certainly it was part of it. To be out there, with other people cutting and to hear their stories and and then come back and eat together afterwards, and to have a dram and so forth. So it was a good day. I think just now the oil is not quite so expensive, but it does fluctuate, I think, and it kind of falls and rises and so forth. So I think people may go back to cutting peat themselves. Certainly it's a good backup to other types of fuel. You can have some oil as well. There's people who might use oil in their kitchen but have a peat fire as well. So it's nice to have the option of both. By itself, it gives a good heat off, but it's not quite maybe as hot as coal and oil. And also, of course, it takes work as well. You've got to clean the fire out and so forth. So it takes a bit of time, the whole process. But certainly, it's really nice to have a peat fire. But it takes work, of course it does.